Good evening, Russell. So kind of you to agree to come back and fill in some of the missing gaps that we had from our webinar.
No, I'm delighted.
And sadly, Kristen couldn't join us. She's busy working, I think. So it's just you and me. So we're just going to go through just a few of the things. I've just to our audience, I've taken the liberty of amalgamating quite a lot of your questions together because they do run in sort of themes. So Russell, if you're happy with that, I might just fire away.
Yes, and please cut me off if I start to ramble on.
I certainly will. All right, so the first one I think is quite a quick one, which was, does Wi-Fi, if you have Wi-Fi on in your house / bedroom, does it affect your sleep?
There's a lot of discussion about whether radio frequency waves, from telephone masts and other devices can affect sleep. There's no good evidence that it does. I'm not saying it might not in some subtle way, but at the moment we don't have any evidence for it affecting our sleep. I know people are working on it. In fact, one of my colleagues, Stuart Pearson in Oxford, has some funding to actually look at this.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it is a topic of serious discussion, but it's an ongoing one.
Okay, well, that's good to know. We shall keep our eyes peeled as to what happens next.
Stuart can give you a lecture on that.
Exactly. And so the second area of questioning, which a lot of people wrote in about, was about adolescents and their sleep patterns, why perhaps their sleep patterns change, and does it then affect the way they work at school and university, given the time schedules that we as adults impose on them?
Yeah, so there is a tendency for adolescents to want to go to bed late and get up late, and if we think about the science behind whether you're a morning person or an evening person, we should unpack that first. And there are three elements that define your chronotype. One, your genetics. So by their contribution to your genes, your parents are still telling you to some extent what time to get up and go to bed. But in terms of adolescence, from about the age of 10 to the late teens, early 20s, there's a tendency to want to go to bed later and later and later. And after your late teens, early 20s, there's a move to a more morning bedtime. Bottom line is, the time you're in your late 50s, you're getting up and going to bed at about the time you got up and went to bed when you were 10. And that's on average about 2 hours earlier than somebody in their late teens, early 20s. And that seems to be associated with the changing hormonal levels over puberty and the change into older age. Now, the third area, which I think is really interesting, is when you see light. So dusk light delays the clock, makes you get up later. Morning light advances the clock, makes you get up earlier. Now, when we were all agricultural workers, we got a symmetrical exposure to both morning, getting up earlier, and evening, getting up later light. Whereas many adolescents are missing morning light and only seeing the evening light. And so they're being pushed to a later time because of their particular light exposure. So those are the sort of things that predispose adolescents to go to bed later. So their hormonal changes and, of course, the exposure to light. But the other area, of course, is the addiction to social media and gaming and all of the other entertainments that you and I didn't have growing up, but our children and grandchildren do have access to. And that's a real problem. And there was a very interesting study from the University of Glasgow, which interviewed adolescents, and they know it's crazy to use social media until the early hours of the morning. They know it's not a good idea because that means they'll get shortened sleep. But their concern is being disconnected from their peer group, and that seems to override it. So what happens is that they have very shortened sleep at night for a variety of reasons. And then, of course, the alarm clock or a parent drives them out of bed in the morning. They struggle through school. And then there's another problem, because the tendency then is to get home from school and have a long sleep, a long nap. And that can be 1 to 2 hours or more. And what that does is push back the sleep pressure, which means it's more difficult to get to sleep that night. So it's a combination of things which can be resolved as a result of sleep education. So we looked at the sleep-wake patterns of early adolescents, and it was quite striking. About 20–25% of them were showing really quite substantially poor sleep-wake profiles. But we then developed an educational package for the teachers to teach to their students. And what was exciting is that the educational package alone actually took that group of poor sleepers, that 20–25%, and improved their sleep enormously. So through education, we can improve sleep. Now, of course, that's also been coupled in some instances with a later start time. Now, the best evidence for an improvement in later, using a later start time comes from the States. So a later start time has reduced self-harm, reduced depression, reduced truantism, and has improved grades. But it's sometimes difficult to compare the studies from the States to the UK because their mornings, the school start times can be at 7:30 in the morning. In most British schools, it's 8:50 to 9 o'clock. Yes. And so our kids are actually starting school later than the States. And so I think, yes, you could conceive of a later start time, let's say 10 o'clock in the UK system, but I'm not sure that would achieve a great deal. And if we do go for a later start time, I think it must be coupled with really good sleep education so that the kids are empowered. They know why they need to sleep and what they can do about not getting more sleep.
Yes, and thank you for that. And do you think that if an adolescent is prone to depression, first and foremost, would their sleep patterns be then getting naturally worse when they reached adolescence?
Yeah, and of course it interacts because the depression can exacerbate the poor sleep. The poor sleep can exacerbate the depression. Right. And so the way to go in and hit it is to try and develop a highly structured sleep regime, getting up, going to bed at the same times. And of course, the problem is the weekends. So many adolescents oversleep, as we've all experienced it for our kids. They tend to oversleep hugely at the weekends. They then miss the morning light, of course. Right. The morning light advances the clock. They get the afternoon light, evening light, and of course that delays the clock. So you can really make things much worse by oversleeping and showing sort of poor sleep education or poor sleep practice over the weekends. So
especially at this time of year, I imagine.
Oh, absolute disaster.
If some may not wake up and have like an hour of daylight.
And it's true also for many individuals who commute, when we were working in buildings. So individuals who get up in the dark, they then travel to work in the tube or something where there's very low light and then be under low lighting conditions in the workplace. And so the failure to connect with the natural light dark cycle is a real issue of clearly, as we've discussed, for adolescents, but also adults as well.
And would those sad lamps help with that for people if they're getting up in a light which had that sad light in it? That might be helpful for many.
Absolutely,
for teenagers and adults alike.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I think I can't remember if I showed the data or not, but 30 minutes of 10,000 lux from a lamp in the morning is very effective at reducing levels of depression, more so, for example, than drugs like Prozac.
No,
so the data really interesting. By 2 weeks, there was a statistical difference with light from placebo. It took 8 weeks for Prozac to have a statistical difference from placebo. So light is doing a number of things. It's stabilizing the sleep wake, but it's probably also having a direct and acute effect on some of the systems within the brain.
Yeah. And so for any of our listeners, the 10,000, I can't remember what it's measured in now, lux exactly, is very important.
Yeah, it's bright light. Yeah. And in fact, the devices now have got quite sophisticated, and so they understand the biology, and you can buy these SAD lamps or other allied lamps with bright light. They know it's got to be bright light.
Okay, I mean, well that's really useful. Yeah. Really useful to know. So moving on to an area which I know is not your 100% expertise, but also one that a load of people are very interested in, including myself, is dreaming.
And you notice in the talk, I neatly sidestepped that whole topic.
Well, it's
I
it's
knew
a
it would come
large
back to bite
topic.
me.
It's a large topic, and a lot of people have a lot. Well, I suppose everybody does it
Yeah.
just as much as everybody is. We did a very interesting thing on our last webinar, actually doing a poll on the people who are watching it, and we asked that question about how many people watching had been exposed either themselves or to a close family member or friend to mental illness.
Yes.
And the poll came back with 95%.
Yes.
Which is huge. So I mean, I think if we couple that 95% with the fact that probably 100% of us dream,
Yeah.
we've got a perfect storm for you, I think.
Yeah. I have to say, it doesn't surprise me. I think that so many of us will be aware of people that we're close to who will have mental health problems at some level. And I think it illustrates the fact that, isn't it extraordinary when it's so common, so prevalent, that we're still not feeling comfortable about talking about it.
I know.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. So I think that there's probably two areas which we should look at in the dream thing, and I might just mention both, and then you could sort of run with it. Is why do we dream in the first place, and what do those dreams tell us?
Yeah.
And then also looking at dreams and how lucid they are, whether we have any control over them, and whether if you're prone to depression, whether there's a negative bias naturally to your dreaming. So if I may let it let it
flow. Yeah, and again, please stop me. So if we talk about the different stages of sleep, there's this REM sleep and non-REM sleep. And so we start the sleep episode by going into non-REM sleep, and we go through a series of stages into deep sleep, slow wave sleep. And then we bounce rapidly from deep sleep into rapid eye movement sleep. And actually, it's fascinating to see. You can look at your partner, and you see that their eyes are moving under the lids. And if you don't have a partner, then look at your dog, because they actually show wonderful.
Well, dogs are whimpering and moving their legs and all sorts.
Exactly. And of course, in REM sleep is where we have our vivid and most complicated dreams. And actually, in humans, we are sort of paralyzed from the neck downwards. And so that's really so we don't act out our dreams. And there's a condition called REM behavioral disorder where that paralysis doesn't occur. And so people have murdered their partners, they've committed some unspeakable acts during REM sleep because the failure to paralyze hasn't kicked in.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah. So what are dreams all about? And it's an area, I think, of immense discussion. The consensus would be that what the brain is trying to do is make sense of its emotional status. And so dreams essentially can reflect where you are in that sort of journey. So if you're experiencing a great deal of anxiety, then you may experience your repetitive anxiety dream. And we talked about those earlier, and we won't go into it publicly. But one very interesting area, I think, was when the Twin Towers were destroyed, and New Yorkers were asked about the content of their dreams. And the dreams that they were experiencing were not planes crashing into towers. They were experiencing being overwhelmed by a tsunami, or being mugged, and so it was a very interesting illustration that they were clearly anxious, and they were trying to resolve their anxiety, but it wasn't by a recapitulation of the event. It was other things that made them anxious and trying to resolve. So dreams seem to be a way in which we work through and resolve some of our emotional problems. That's the consensus. I mean, many people are absolutely convinced that they have predictive power, and that you dream about something and it's going to happen, but there's no evidence for that whatsoever.
Maybe that's just wishful thinking when they're good. When they're good,
yes, that could be it. Yeah, and so basically, it's a way of resolving your emotional status. Now, I think that's the sort of thing about dreams. And if we move then into what's called lucid dreaming, and again, it's not an area I have great expertise, but in general, this is where individuals are able to influence their dreaming experience. And so they can manipulate what's going on. And you can do this in a number of ways. I've never done it. So I'm as a typical academic, I'm speaking from what I've read. And so, for example, if some people will set the alarm clock 4 or 5 hours after, roughly when they fall asleep. And because we tend to have most of our REM sleep towards the end of the sleep episode, the alarm clock will wake them in a REM episode whilst they're dreaming. And then a number of things, you can think very actively about the dream you've just experienced, and then try and going back to sleep, and then sort of start to manipulate it. Other people will wake from a dream and then write it down and obsess about it, and then try and go back to sleep. Or yet another technique is that they'll wake from a dream and then will just think about it, not write it down, but think about it, eyes closed, and try and get back into that dream, and change the content. For many, it's a bit like a party game,
Right.
the kind of, but for some, it has some value. So, for example, if you have really recurring nightmares, which you find deeply upsetting, people are encouraged to go into lucid dreaming so that you can experience this and appreciate it's not real. So you can say, hang on, this isn't genuinely happening. And I think actually many of us may have experienced that to some extent. If we're having something particularly terrifying, we can think, hang on, this isn't real. And then we can convince ourselves. Well, you can actually manipulate the situation like that. Another area is in post-traumatic shock and stress, whereby you've experienced some horrifying thing and you keep on running over it in your mind. And lucid dreaming can help resolve some of that. The danger is that what happens is that you can get some conditions whereby you don't then get that paralysis whilst you're dreaming. So you can start to disrupt what's going on to the sleep-wake structure. And so during REM sleep, you normally have the paralysis. Well, actually, that paralysis may not kick in, and you might start to act out, perhaps sometimes even violently, those dreams. Unless there's a good clinical reason to have lucid dreams, I don't think there's a good reason to indulge in it.
No, it sounds like it could be a bit it's awful if you were sort of manipulating it in the wrong way, and then you had that REM disorder.
Yeah,
could get into all sorts of trouble then.
Well, exactly. And does if you're distressed, if you are depressed, could that reflect the content of the dreams? I think that's really very interesting. I mean, one of the things that I may have touched on in the talk was that the tired brain remembers different sorts of things. And what the tired brain remembers is the negative experiences that you've experienced during the day and forgets the positive ones. And because when we're dreaming, we're sort of kind of recapitulating, and indeed, and when we're not dreaming, we're also probably consolidating to memory, then yes, the tired brain will remember the negative things and they will be selectively laid down to memory. And of course, because dreaming is trying to resolve anxiety issues to some extent, yes, if you have states of anxiety or depression, it could very well reflect some of the dream content. And again, I guess that would be a reason why lucid dreaming might be useful, because you could go in and say, well, actually, this isn't real. I can manipulate it, but I don't think it's something I would encourage people to do unless there's a real clinical need.
And just a quick question. This is something literally I just thought of now. It wasn't from one of our audience. So cheekily, I'm just slipping one in. But if you were to take, I mean, I fortunately don't need to or want to particularly, but take sleeping pills. Does that type of sleep allow you to dream, or is REM sleep knocked out of the park with a sleeping pill?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about sleeping tablets and other sedatives, like alcohol, for example, is that they sedate the brain, and they can actually suppress some of the important things going on within the brain. So memory formation, for example, can be significantly impaired by certain types of sedatives, and indeed alcohol is extremely effective at sedating, but you really disrupt the sleep very significantly. And again, it's like so many things. The occasional use of a sleeping tablet to sort of stabilize or try and correct it, but it's where it becomes something that you're dependent upon for sleep. It's always best to try, sleep education, sleep behavioral therapy before resorting to drugs. Clearly, many people from time to time use it, but it's not necessarily a good way forward. And certainly, for when individuals are experiencing mild dementia, there can be very disturbed sleep. And one of the clinical interventions is to use sedatives. And of course, what that can do is make the dementia and the forgetfulness and the memory loss even worse.
That's so interesting.
So
yeah.
One, I think, a really interesting study from the Netherlands, again, going back to my pet hobby, which is light, actually went into the nursing home environment and had very bright lights during the day areas, darkness in the bedrooms at night, transformed very ragged sleep-wake profiles to much more robust sleep-wake profiles. And very, very interestingly, in those individuals showing mild dementia, they improve cognition by 10%, simply by stabilizing sleep-wake and not being dependent upon the sleeping tablets.
That's fascinating. It is fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, it really is. No, that's brilliant. Well, I think we've done dreams. I'm sure we could carry on. There are thousands of other questions, but I'm going to suppress them and just go to the last, as I'm aware of time and everything, but the last sort of question, which is an interesting one, is that in therapy, is sleep used to treat mental illness, and will it be in the future more prevalent, do you think, in treatment?
Yeah. And again, just to sort of step back, why do we always have this extraordinary relationship between sleep disruption and mental illness? It's so incredibly prevalent. And part of it is that there is a sort of overlap within the brain. Those neural circuits generating the sleep-wake cycle and the neural circuits underpinning our mental health status will overlap. So if there's a change in one of those bits of the circuitry, a change in the pattern of neurotransmitter release, which predisposes you to a mental health problem, then it's almost certainly going to have some impact upon sleep. And that's because the two are intimately associated, and now that fits beautifully because we now have identified genes which were linked to mental health, which also affect the sleep-wake pattern. And in fact, some of the key clock genes that have been identified have also been linked to mental health. So there is that sort of there is an overlap, but there's much more than just that. Because of course, the poor sleep will distort physiology so much, change the whole hormonal milieu. It will change, so much that could then exacerbate the mental health status. And of course, the mental health status could then feed back and exacerbate the sleep-wake problem. So what we proposed some time ago now was that if we can consolidate sleep-wake, do we reduce the severity of mental health illness? And Dan Freeman looked at this in a very large study and partially stabilized sleep-wake in individuals who were experiencing poor sleep. And what partial sleep-wake stabilization did was reduce levels of hallucinatory experiences and paranoia. So we now have really good evidence that sleep is a potentially really useful therapeutic target in our arsenal of tools to try and impact upon mental health. And one very interesting area, I think, for the future, which is an area we really need to explore, is that we can identify individuals who are at high risk versus low risk at developing mental health problems. And working with Guy Goodwin, again in Oxford Psychiatry, we're able to show that the sleep-wake patterns of individuals at high risk of developing bipolar showed a change and were beginning to fall apart, even though they didn't show any overt signs of bipolar. They wouldn't have been clinically diagnosed as bipolar, but they're already showing a sleep-wake problem, which also supports this whole idea of this overlap between the two systems. Yes. And the really exciting thing for me would be, okay, if we take those high-risk kids and we make every effort to stabilize the sleep-wake patterns in those individuals, do we delay onset of bipolar, or while the brain is still plastic, because remember, these issues are arising sort of late adolescence, while the brain is still plastic, could we then knock the brain into a slightly different developmental trajectory whereby we don't see the full expression of a condition like bipolar? So I think that both in individuals with a mental health problem, it could be used as a therapy. And potentially those individuals who are at risk of developing these conditions, we might actually be able to get in early and sort of divert or even delay the onset of some of these conditions, which is, I think, really exciting for the future.
No, it's incredibly exciting. I mean, I think I was just thinking as you were speaking now about my two children, not to bring it back to personal stuff, but just observing them as tiny babies when they're certainly they're not that now, and they're deep into the late nights and waking up late. But when
I should talk to them.
Yeah, I think you definitely should. But they were so different in their sleep patterns, just from birth, really.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting to see how that hasn't really changed.
Yeah.
One found it really difficult to go to sleep and has always had a bit of a struggle, and the other one absolutely happy as Larry to be, you know, in bed and sleeping, and still adores sleeping now, just for very, very long hours. But it's just fascinating, and one wonders, you know, if I don't want to speak too personally about them, but correlating that to their kind of mental health is actually quite a revelation in a way, because
I think you raise a very interesting point too, because of the complexity of sleep, you know, multiple brain structures interacting, all the key brain neurotransmitters, the biological clock regulating it, you know, the sleep pressure, levels of adenosine, all of that sort of, the immense complexity means that really subtle changes in the sort of neural circuitry of the sleep-wake architecture could nudge you from, you know, a stable sleep-wake into an abnormal pattern or slightly abnormal, just with tiny tweaks. And you know, it's so fascinating. And now we're in a position where we can start to understand to a much greater degree the neuroscience underpinning 30% of our biology. And thankfully, it's now being taken seriously. And not only, you know, as an extraordinarily interesting topic to understand how we function and how the brain functions, but also how it impacts across the whole domains of health and mental health.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very, very good place to end our little recap, because, you know, yes, we all know how many, you know, what percentage of people suffer from mental health and people who have problems with sleep. So I think the kind of more and more information we can get, and the more awareness on this subject matter, hopefully will solve a lot of problems along the way for people.
Well, the exciting thing for me is that it's not endless hand-wringing and doom and gloom. There's an approach that we now have good evidence will make a difference, and I think that's what's so exciting.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Russell, for giving us the extra time, and I'm sure people will be fascinated to hear what you've got to say.
Great pleasure, Dora, and thanks again to everybody who wrote in with such terrific questions.